Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, thank you for joining me once again today, and welcome back to Total War Warhammer 2. This video isn't a single battle. In this video, I'm actually going to be talking about a faction, specifically the Dwarves. I've been having some discussions lately on the Total War forums and on other forums and with other friends about the Dwarves as a faction and their place in the metagame. And to be honest, I still maintain my original position, which is that despite the Dwarf buffs, Dwarves are still a faction that has some really serious problems when it comes to multiplayer. Now, full disclosure, I myself am a terrible Dwarf player. I just don't quite get their playstyle. So most of this comes from the perspective of me playing against Dwarves, because I don't play as them very often. At some point, I really need to take the time to sit down and learn to play the Dwarves well. But as it is, I'm kind of talking from the perspective of a Dwarf opponent, because I play against Dwarves online quite a bit. And from my perspective, playing against Dwarves is one of the easiest matchups for some factions. Now, there are some factions the Dwarves can do very well against. For instance, they can do very well against the Lizardmen. They can do pretty well against the Empire. They can do well against Bretonnia overall. Now, Bretonnia is still a bit sketchy. They can do very well against the Wood Elves. There are some factions they can't do well against, and by that I don't mean that they're going to 100% lose every match. Rather, what I mean is, in order to win, the Dwarf player has to be significantly more skilled than the other player. Against the High Elves, the Dark Elves, the Skaven, the Greenskins, some arguably Chaos, against all of those factions, the Dwarves have a really hard time. And that's because there's a combination of factors that make the usual Dwarf armies that you're going to see online very hard to use against those factions. So as an example, I'm going to be showing actually two replays of games that I played against a friend of mine the other day. Now, I'm not showing these replays off to like call him out as a bad Dwarf player, by no means. Rather, I think he's pretty typical in his Dwarf play. And the armies that he builds here are pretty typical of Dwarf armies that I see online. I see armies like this a lot. So this is an example of a very static Dwarf army. We've got Dwarf warriors and longbeards chevroned up for more leadership and defense. We've got some quarrelers, we've got some thunderers, we've got some artillery, and we have a couple of slayers. In this case, they're off on the flank. He's trying something sneaky here in the woods. And we have a Dwarf lord, who's a very solid defensive melee lord. Didn't take any of the special lords, presumably to save money. Didn't take any of the extra heroes, the runesmith or the thane or anything. He does have the banner of lost holds to boost his infantry, and this is one of several area of effect buffs the Dwarves can bring that really encourage packing melee infantry up in a tight space and holding. Really encourage boxing, really. I am playing the Skaven, and full confession, it took me a couple of games to feel out how the Skaven are supposed to deal with the Dwarves, but now that I've got it figured out, I really don't think I'm going to lose more than, 1 in 5 or 10 matches against the Dwarves, just because it's very hard for them to stop this. Or, not this exactly, but things like this. Anyway, I have Queek Headtaker. I have a Plague Priest on the Plague Furnace. Basically, he's a great big target, and all I want him to do is live long enough to get close and deliver a Plague. Because despite their magic resistance, Plague does huge damage against Dwarven units. He also has Vermintide and Wither and Bless with Filth, in case he survives long enough for those to be useful, but I don't really expect him to. I've got one Doom Wheel, I've got one Warp Lightning Cannon, I have a front line of Skaven slaves, quote-unquote front line, they're not really much of anything. I have 2 units of Rat Ogres, way back here, and I have 4 Death Runners. And Death Runners are basically one of the perfect anti-Dwarf units. There's several factions that have what I call perfect anti-Dwarf units. Death Runners are definitely one of them. Good melee stats, high armor piercing, and the Weeping Blades that reduce armor. Basically, these guys just murder armored Dwarf infantry and armored Dwarf skirmishers. And because of the way the Dwarf army is built, armored infantry and armored skirmishers are always going to be the core of their armor. So I'm advancing. My Warp Lightning Cannons are shooting. He's remaining static, as many Dwarf players do. He's kind of turtled up on this hill. He's taken good terrain, and he wants to use it. So he's got his Thunderers and his Quarrelers are both taking some damage from the Warp Lightning Cannons. Over here, I didn't even notice these Slayers until that informational little bubble popped up. So my Rat Ogres just charged in, and I went, oh crap, pull him out, pull him out. He also pulled his Slayers away, which is nice because it let me get my Rat Ogres away fairly intact. Of course, my Skaven Slayers are taking damage, but I don't care about them. They exist only to focus the enemy's attention. The cannon is actually shooting at my Doom Wheel. It's scored some hits and done some damage, but the Doom Wheel is so fast that the cannon can't hit it all that much, and he's now focusing on the Plague Priest, who is closer and more threatening, which is fine, which is a perfectly wise and reasonable decision to make. These Death Runners, I've popped the concealment bombs just to be absolutely sure they won't be seen, and so they have still not been spotted. They're still hidden. Look at this. Look how close they get without being... Now they're spotted, but now it is far too late to do anything about it. So the Death Runners are going to get right into the cannons. My front line has collided. My Plague Priest is actually dead, but the Plague goes off regardless, and it wipes this unit of Thunderers out. Just annihilates them, as well as doing some damage to those Quarrelers, and then to these Thunderers as they walk past it. So this unit of Thunderers is just taken off the board, practically. I mean, they're down to 21 models and about a fifth of their health. Over here, my Rat Ogres are coming in from the flanks, with the Slayers in pursuit, getting into the ranged units. So this is the problem with static Dwarf play. The infantry has been held down. The infantry is winning. I mean, the infantry is absolutely cutting those Skaven slaves to ribbons, but it's being held down, and while it's being held down, my mobile units, including the Doom Wheel, and the Death Runners, and the Rat Ogres have all gotten into the ranged units, and it's a mess back here. The cannon is already offline, the Grudge Thrower is about to be offline, these Thunderers are already broken, those Quarrelers are broken, these Thunderers are about to be broken because they're being attacked by Rat Ogres. He's got his Lord back here, but the Lord can't salvage this situation. There's just too many dangerous, fast, armor-piercing units in the back line, causing his ranged units to just evaporate. In the front line, meanwhile, some of my Rat Ogres are in there. The Warp Lightning Cannon, incidentally, is still shooting, has not been shut down. There were too many large targets, and the cannon could not effectively focus on any one in order to destroy it. Over here, I'm rolling up his flank with some of the Death Runners, so these Dwarf Warriors are going away, and I'm bringing my Rat Ogres over to join them. These Longbeards are taking a lot of damage. I'm chasing his ranged units off to be sure they do not return to the battlefield with my Death Runners and my Doom Wheel. And over here, these Death Runners are just happily stuck in. They've already got 60 kills, and they're chewing apart Quarrelers, Grudge Thrower, even some Slayers. They're doing some damage to the Slayers, too. I mean, they are going to lose against the Slayers, but they'll do quite a bit of damage, and when they break, they'll come back, because that's what Skaven do. Shatters over here. These Quarrelers are back, but they're very reduced in number. And at this point, the micro load for the Dwarf player trying to get everything in the right place is starting to take a little bit of a toll. So these Slayers now coming in. He's forming a ball here. And forming a ball is probably the best thing that Dwarf melee infantry can do in a situation like this, because if they get into a big lump with the buffs from the Lord, often they'll win. But at this point, he's already taken too much damage. If you look at the numbers, I've lost about 400, he's lost about 450, so he's actually lost more than me in strictly numerical terms, which is a very bad sign for a Dwarf player playing against Skaven. Over here, these Longbeards are getting crushed. I'm basically taking his army apart piecemeal. And if he had blobbed up a little bit harder a little bit sooner, maybe he could have avoided that, but it's too late at this point. The Lord is out here trying to escape Queek, who dropped trophy heads on him a moment ago. The Doom Wheel is pushing in, and I then realized that the Slayers are going to do too much damage, so the Doom Wheel is going to peel out this way and go back over there. Queek is in the middle of the melee, fighting, and it says he's losing, but he's not. He's doing a lot of damage and not taking a lot of damage. And pretty soon he can pop Verminous Valor and go after the Lord again. And now all of my armor-piercing, high-damage units can collapse on this blob, take out what remains of the Longbeards and Dwarf Warriors, and of course the Lord. And once that happens, all that will be left is the Slayers, and Slayers cannot deal with this blob. Once again, over here I'm just sending out fast units to chase away routing enemies, and they're not going to be able to effectively come back. So this battle is, I can fast forward at this point because the battle's over. So you can see the Doom Wheel going over here, taking out the Quarrelers. I've shattered those units, so the Rat Ogres are coming back. These Rat Ogres are peeling away. I'm just fighting here, and I'm fine to stay here because my Death Runners are just in here racking up the kills. I just killed the Dwarf Lord, so all of his units are routing except for the Slayers, and then I just have to clean up the Slayers. So, yeah, we can see where this is going. Technically, it has a minute left, but that minute is just going to be killing the last few Slayers. And I'll just bring all my units in, everything else is shattered. That's how static dwarf play ends. Because, against static dwarf play, I get to pick my targets. I get to choose where I'm engaging. I can find a place that isn't guarded, because you can't guard every place unless you literally box up on top of a hill or something. And even if you do that, you can't concentrate your forces enough to defend when I can take all these units, these 7 units, plus the fire of this Warp Lightning Cannon, and I can put them on one corner of the box and crack it wide open. So static dwarf play ends this way, with Death Runners murdering your entire formation, and Doom Wheels and Warp Lightning Cannons and Radars and all this stuff. This is why Skaven are one of the factions that have a big advantage against Dwarves, because I have stalking infantry that have armor piercing, I have mobility, I have good artillery that is useful against Dwarf infantry. People say it's not, but it is. Warp Lightning Cannons do a ton of damage against armored infantry. I have Doom Wheels, so basically chariots, armor piercing infantry, fast AP, artillery, and chariots. Those are the 4 things that are vital for an anti-dwarf list. Ranged armor piercing, also really good. So now, let's take a look at the second replay here. Okay, so here's the second replay. I'm playing as the Greenskins against the Orcs. As the Greenskins against the Dwarves, sorry. So this is a real classic old world grudge match. And I've got a front line of Black Orcs, which are absolutely destructive against Dwarvish infantry. I've got Grimgore. This is one of the matchups where Grimgore is actually really useful because he's a small target and armored and armor piercing, with Gitsnick and Wah and Stand Your Ground. I've got an Orc Shaman, no mount, who I have given Foot of Gork and Here We Go, and that's all. I've given him the Scroll of Shielding as well. I've got 1 Goblin to meet shield. Over here, I have 2 nasty Skulkers stalking armor-piercing infantry. In the back, I have 3 units of Night Goblin Squig Hoppers, including Durkit's Squigs. These are another of the perfect anti-dwarf units, and honestly, just the existence of units like this is why it's so hard to play Dwarves. Night Goblin Squig Hoppers are armor-piercing cavalry, fast cavalry, speed 82, with a pretty decent anti-infantry bonus. That bonus of 10 means their melee attack is actually 33, and their weapon strength is actually 37, most of which is armor-piercing against infantry. On top of that, they have an okay charge bonus. So basically, these guys, since they're so fast, they can always pick their target, they can always get in where they want, take fights that they want, not what the Dwarves want, and they'll destroy any armored infantry unit they hit pretty cost-effectively. I mean, they only cost 650, and they can easily take out a unit of Longbeards that cost 650. I mean, no contest. I also have Mulgrub's Mangy Marauders over here because they are a fast armor-piercing missile unit, and they also have okay melee stats. Not great, but okay. And that 10 armor-piercing damage per arrow is pretty significant. And then I have 3 Rock Lobbers, including the Hammer of Gork. Artillery against the Dwarves is fantastic. And the fact of the matter is, despite having the best artillery, Dwarves can't win artillery fights because, while their cannons might be able to destroy enemy artillery fast, enemy artillery can take out their blocks of slow, heavily armored infantry faster. So my opponent, once again, he's taken a pretty standard Dwarf list, a little bit more mobile this time. He's got a front line of Dwarf warriors, and he's mixed in some Longbeards with great weapons for armor piercing, which is a great idea against the Black Orcs. He's got a couple of handgunners, 3 handgunners, and he's got a Dwarf Lord. He has brought a cannon and 2 Grudge Throwers this time, as well as 2 Slayers. So, once again, pretty standard Dwarf list. And the Dwarf Lord has, I believe he has the Banner of Lost Holds still. Yep, he still has the Banner of Lost Holds. So, this map is not ideal. This is a pretty good map for the Dwarves, because they can start way up here on the hill, block choke points. I mean, this is about the best situation that Dwarven infantry is ever gonna get. It does mean that I can hide from his artillery by getting below this cliff, which is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to move my artillery up and start shelling him. Over here, my nasty Skulkers have been seen, so I'm pulling them back, and the Squig Hoppers back here are starting to move, but they're kind of waiting because I can see the enemy advancing. Mulgrub's Mangy Marauders are flanking around. So once again, this is kind of a problem. The Dwarves just don't have mobility. They have a really good position right at the moment, but they can't really move around, so they're a bit of a static target. The Thunderers are already starting to take damage from the artillery. The Dwarf Warriors, the Longbeards, all of that stuff, I can pretty much pick my targets with these guys because there isn't really any great threat to them except the cannons, and the artillery is about to be offline. Because the Squig Hoppers are coming in, and the Squig Hoppers, when they charge in, do quite a bit of damage to the artillery. So the Squig Hoppers come in, and they pull straight through. The Dwarves can't stop this, the Slayers can't catch them because they're twice the speed of Slayers, so they're going to pull straight through, and now they're going to go for the ranged units. So I'm not even really coordinating this attack, it's just happening, and the Dwarves don't have a good way to stop it. If they had a Thane with the Tormentor Sword, that could help. If they had some miners scattered around, that could help, but that wouldn't stop this from happening still. Once again, I'm not showing this to try to crap on my friend as a bad player. I'm not a great player. But it's very easy for factions that are not dwarves to do this to dwarves. So one unit of Squig Hoppers has routed, but it'll come back. It's still at half health. Over here, these other Slayers are trying to chase off the Marauders. They're just going to get shot to pieces doing that. And now my Black Orcs are coming in against the melee line, which is weakened by artillery. I'm going to drop a Foot of Gork just for fun on these Longbeards with great weapons. And they take a bunch of damage from that because the Foot of Gork does a bunch of armor-piercing damage. And now the Squig Hoppers are going to form up right here, kind of pick their targets at leisure. The enemy ranged units are largely routing off. Do have some artillery back here that's coming back online. But the Black Orcs are going to win this fight because they can chew through Dwarf Warriors and Longbeards all day, every day. My Durkit Squigs are coming in. Those Longbeards are already routed. These Dwarf Warriors are pretty beaten up. Gonna send in some more Squig Hoppers over here to take out the artillery once again. Over here, he's still chasing the mangy Marauders and still never going to catch them. So, I mean, he could pull these guys back to help, but that just means that the mangy Marauders will be able to get straight into the artillery like the Squig Hoppers are doing right now. So down here, I'm dropping my my buffs, my Wah, my Stand My Ground. It puts my stats up into the stratosphere. It means my Black Orcs are going to absolutely murder these Dwarf infantry, and of course I'm getting the nasty Skulkers back up around the flank and into the fight here. So this Dwarf infantry has absolutely no chance at this point. The Dwarf ranged units are coming back online, but they have taken a lot of damage, and they're taking more because those artillery units can't be stopped. The cannon could be shooting at them, but the cannon is trying to salvage this situation. Over here, those Slayers just getting kited to infinity and beyond. And now the cannon is actually destroyed? Question mark? Not sure why his crews aren't getting back on the cannon and the grudge thrower. I think at this point he's just a little bit overwhelmed. But these Dwarf Warriors are getting chewed up by Squig Hoppers. I'm about to pull them through back into the Thunderers. Yep, there he goes. He's getting back on the cannon. This unit of Thunderers is being routed by artillery fire. Over here, the infantry is getting chewed up. So there's nothing that can be done. Once again, at this point, 3 minutes left to go, or 4 minutes left to go, but the battle is already over. All he has left is his artillery. My Night Goblin Squig Hoppers have rallied in the woods, so they're about to come back in. His ranged units are destroyed, except for this one, which is half destroyed. His infantry is entirely destroyed. His lord is being chased away by Grimgor, because Grimgor, really only Grombrindle can fight Grimgor, especially if Grimgor brings Gitsnick. That plus 26 melee attack pushes him up to almost 100, and plus 40% AP damage pushes his armor-piercing damage up to over 400, which makes it almost impossible to win a duel with Grimgor when that's active, unless you're a monster. But so, yeah, once again, we've now reached the point where everything is shattered except the Slayers. I haven't even really engaged these Slayers. I mean, these are supposed to be the Dwarven anti-large option, but I brought a bunch of large units, and they just didn't fight the Slayers. They didn't have to, because Slayers don't have the mobility to catch large units. They don't have the ability to do the job that they're supposed to do, really. I mean, it's difficult to balance dwarves because since dwarves have no cavalry and thus very limited mobility, or almost no mobility, you kind of have to make them a little bit overpowered at what they can do. You can see the mangy Marauder's just going to charge in now because they might as well. I've won the battle. So the dwarves can only do a few things, so they have to be very good at doing those things. But being very good at having armored infantry and armored skirmishers, which is what the dwarves have, does not really make up for having no mobility and no ability to control the pace of the battle. which is what I see the problem as when it comes to average level dwarf player. Yes, if you're a very, very high level player, playing as dwarves, you can mitigate these problems. You can do things with Vanguard deployment that allow you to control the battle a little bit better. You can do things with Rangers and with Gyrocopters that allow you to control the pace of the battle a little bit better. But for most dwarf players, you can't. You can't control the pace of the battle. When you're up against people who have speed 82, armor-piercing anti-infantry cavalry, and armor-piercing artillery, and armor-piercing infantry, and stalking armor-piercing units, when you're up against people who have all of these tools that seem basically custom designed to annihilate dwarven units, there's not really much you can accomplish. It's very, very difficult to get an even fight because the other people don't have to fight you on even terms. Your even terms involve you standing in a line and waiting for the enemy to hit you. So when you're playing as dwarves, if you want to avoid a situation like this, where you spend the last 2 minutes of the battle just sitting and watching a unit of unbreakable slayers get wrecked by every unit in the enemy army, you really have to focus on, ironically, mobility. You really have to focus on battlefield control, because without that battlefield control, you end up with this. Just dead dwarves. A battlefield completely full of dead dwarves. The fact of the matter is that dwarves rely very heavily on a couple of factors, on armor and on defensive buffs and on ranged firepower. And all of those things are actually very simple to mitigate in the metagame as it stands. Armor-piercing units completely negate armor as a factor. Fast cavalry can get around your defensive structures and your defensive formations and get into your vulnerable, squishy units. You can see here, these Thunderers accomplished almost nothing. The artillery, on average, accomplished very little. I mean, my artillery didn't get a whole lot of kills either, but the kills they did get were on dwarven units that are quite valuable, and this was pretty much the worst possible situation for them. On a more flat map, these rock lobbers would have done a lot more damage. So anyway, just kind of my thoughts on dwarves. If you're playing as dwarves, you really have to put a lot of thought not into your strengths, but into your weaknesses, because as the dwarves, your strengths are plenty strong. Your infantry is plenty strong. Your ranged units are plenty powerful. Your artillery is plenty strong. You don't really have to worry about shoring them up. What you have to worry about is dealing with all of the things that you don't have good counters to. So, for example, the Tormentor Sword that the Thane has, I think is a fantastic addition to the dwarf roster. And it's almost vital to have that or the Rune of Wrath and Ruin, or both, just in order to mitigate the mobility advantage that the enemy will always enjoy over you. Having a lot of cheap defensive units scattered around, like miners with blasting charges, work well for this. Dwarf warriors work well for this. Kind of scattered around in order to give you responses when people sweep in from your flanks and your rear and all around you. I think that's very important. You can't have a solid front line made up of all your melee units, like a lot of factions can get away with. I mean, as the orcs, you can pretty much have a big old line of all of your tough melee units right out front, and you just kind of slam it face first into the enemy, and then your support units do their thing. As the dwarves, you can't afford to do that, because unless you've gone full melee rush, which can be done with the dwarves, but unless you've done that, you need to have something to defend all these guys. And Slayers can't do it. Slayers are too expensive, and they can only be in one place at a time. So your 900-point Slayer unit in a battle probably will not kill one of my 650-point Night Goblin Squighoppers. Certainly not my 750-point Durkid Squigs. And so they're not going to pay for themselves, unless you can tie something down with a Tormentor Sword or a Rune of Wrath and Ruin or something, and then get the Slayers onto it. So playing as the dwarves, you can play dwarves aggressively, but no matter how you play dwarves, you always have to have an eye very, very firmly fixed on your own defense, because with the slow mobility that dwarves have, you're always going to be on the tactical defensive against the enemy. So anyway, thank you to Warhammer 651 for letting me use his replays here as examples. Once again, I'm not saying you're a bad player, dude. I think you're a pretty decent Dwarf player. You're certainly a lot like many other Dwarf players that I've played against. I just think Dwarves are a really, really hard faction, or at least they have definitely 4 really bad matchups. High Elves, Dark Elves, Greenskins, and Skaven. Those are very bad matchups for the Dwarves, and they don't have many good ones. So, just something to think about, I guess. Thank you all so much for watching and listening to me ramble. If you agree or disagree, leave a comment. I'd love to talk about it. If you want to play a Dwarf army against me and show me why I'm wrong, by all means, leave me your Steam name. I'll add you as a friend, and we can fight a couple of battles. So thank you all so much once again, and I'll see you in the next one.